Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Hearts of Iron 4 Dev Diary. Today we're going to be covering the other side of the Japanese focus tree, taking a look at some of the ahistorical roots. Luckily for me, this week's Dev Diary isn't as large as last week's, but that doesn't mean there isn't so much to talk about, covering the three big ways you can go: monarchy, democracy, and of course communism. So without further ado, let's see what you can achieve if you were to step on the time warp butterfly. Our dev diary begins by looking at the Imperial way, or basically the monarchist branch, where you try and succeed to create Hirohito, presumably, as the leader of non-aligned Japan. For those who missed it from last week, the political branches start off on a slight delayed timer by an event, the February 26 incident, and depending on which option you choose, that will lock in your political path. So, in the case of choosing the time has come to return to tradition, the Kodaha will seize the Ministry of War, the Imperial Hotel, the National Diet, as well as the Imperial Palace. Taking that option will lock in the first focus: revere the Emperor, destroy the traitors, and unlock the majority of this central monarchist focus tree, as well as the shared branches with the historical tree, the one to go north and deal with the Soviet Union, the one in the middle to deal with striking south, so going after Indochina, going after Dutch East Indies, even going after Australia, and the one on the right, which is to deal with China. Considering that in the previous version, Japan who goes monarchist can really only go after the Soviet Union, and you have to kind of manually go after China, this focus tree has far more options for you to go after. Now we can do some slight overview of some of the focuses before we take a closer look, just to get a feel for the focus tree. At the very beginning, you have the option to authorize aid for Ethiopia, which is probably a focus you're going to want to do as quickly as possible, especially considering it's taken you 2 months to even get this focus done. This is of course shared with the Ethiopian tree, which does have paths to ask for help from Japan, so not completely a mismatch. After that, you have to gain some control over the government to begin the Showa restoration. After that comes a series of mini branches all across the board, including allying the League of Blood and the Masterless Samurai, so maybe a little bit more militarist, dealing with the Zaibatsu and the industrial power within the nation. On the right, you might want to deal with some of the more communist elements, as well as indoctrination in the military academy to subdue the Kwangtung army, who, if you may remember, have a great desire to go after the Chinese. So if you didn't want to have a formal declaration on China, then taking this focus might help you. Note down here at the bottom, align the Concordia Association and integrate the Great Manchurian Empire. It seems that by doing this, you have the option to take your rule over Manchuria and turn it into a shared state, or maybe even just straight up core it into one nation. That could be very interesting, especially if it means that you could, for example, using your China tree, expand Manchuria, and then come back over here, and then integrate Manchuria after it has gained what? Cores on all of China? And then do you, as Japan, just core China using this path? That could be promising. For our main central branch though, we can embrace Kokutai, which is kind of this revered, mythological, prestigious view of Japan, with a mutually exclusive choice. Do you want to go Shogunate Japan, or do you just want to stick with the Emperor? This culminates in choosing your colours and deciding how factions should work. In the centre, we have the option to join the Axis. You can create your own faction and go it alone, and very interestingly, Japan did have good relations with Poland in this time period, and as such there is an option to have a kind of faction with Poland, but we'll get onto that in a sec. Lastly, things get more and more powerful as the presence of Japan is succeeding, grows ever more. The spirit of the imperial nation, societal Bushido, things get very traditional, but also become kind of mythical and symbolic, with focuses like the Yamato spirit, the footsteps of Jimmu, the jeweled spear has struck. Now let's take a closer look at some of these focuses. The first focuses we get to see are the faction choices, and not too many surprises in here. The enemy of our enemy is basically just the Japanese shogunate seeks to join the Axis, return to Sakhalin, can create faction called the Japanese Sphere. The most interesting one here though is utilize our Polish friendship, which, because of a shared rivalry with the Soviet Union, both Japan and Poland can create an anti-Soviet pact with each other, which, Assuming one country finds itself in a defensive war with the Soviet Union, the other will be called in. I'm unsure as to when this would be used historically, because Poland basically gets capitulated out by Germany early on, and then the territory is just given to the Soviet Union. Additionally, Japan really only gets declared war on in the very kind of end of the game, and by that point Poland is long an exiled nation, or it has only just been restored. Note of course that you're not forming a faction with Poland, although that might eventually become an option, but if it isn't, and the Soviet Union does declare war on, let's say, Japan, then Poland by this point would be in the Allies, which means you would get called through the Allies. Maybe you then join the Allies. It's interesting to see how much could come of this. Ultimately, of course, the easiest option to go for, though, is to just make your own faction. I had mentioned this in my overview, but to reiterate, subduing the Kwantung army gives you the ability to rein in the army and ensure they do not act independently, meaning that they won't force you into conflict with China if you don't want to. Something that caught me off guard, and might catch you off guard, is that even though this is ahistorical, it does share the ideology shift that happens in the historical path. So with the focus Societal Bushido, you get the event The Question of Morality, Bushido and Fash, which means you get to choose the ideology of your country. I believe the 4 characters we see on the right leading the nations are the differences between 4 different types. So Constitutional Emperor non-aligned gets you the military prime minister. If you go Fash, Constitution, you get Sadao Araki, or I guess kind of a shogunate representative. Non-aligned monarchy, with pure ultimate monarchy power, is Hirohito himself, but you can also go Fash monarchy and get Yasuhito, the Emperor Genka. In terms of buffs, I suppose it's always optional, but personally I think the military prime minister is probably giving you the most bang for your buck with land doctrine cost reduction. In terms of just raw roleplay aura though, I think you have to go with Hirohito. He's just the best candidate for the job. Taking a brief look at some of the wider focuses across the branch, they note that going with the ahistorical monarchy Japan, a lot of the army is going to be sourced from rural areas, and with that the hyper-industrialized ultimate warfare kind of gameplay is reduced. We see this for example with Supremacy of Will, where yes, you can have more kind of loyal, aggressive fighters in the sense that they are not thinking as much about it, but your research speed has gone down. We can also see it at the bottom. We've revitalized the rural areas, focusing of course on building up those rural areas from where your wartime soldiers come from. Ultimately, I think all of the buffs in here are pretty good. Nothing to really complain about. You could be cautious a little bit of the 70 days, but I do see 135 days in here, so not a complete disaster. The last thing to talk about is some of those focuses that are propagandizing the mythological tales of Japan as they spread across the world. To go over some examples, we see the footsteps of Jimmu having you follow in the founder's great path of conquering in a great eastern expedition in the name of the gods, with buffs across the board, offensive penalty stability modifier, just good stuff. I am particularly struck by the jeweled spear because what does it define as Asian? This is something I'm going to be talking about a little bit later because I think this can get kind of crazy in certain contexts, but at least here it's just about creating claims on Asian states, getting war goals for them, and then rinse repeat, so kind of a very managed expansion. Ultimately, that brings us to the end of the ahistorical monarchist Japanese path, the Imperial way. And in quick review, I don't think they've gone too cray-cray with it. It seems to do kind of what you'd expect, expands upon more options beyond just going after the Soviet Union, and gives you some of that mythological, great power, kind of mystical flavour that you might be looking for, without giving you too much dramatization. Surely that will continue into the future paths. Wink wink nudge nudge. Next up we have a turn towards democracy. Flipping back the timeline, we go back to the February 26 incident, and this time the military must be reined in. This is the split that also comes with the communist path, so whether you're going democracy or communist, you will want to rein in the military. With that though also comes the path towards civil war. Due to the strength of the military in this time period, they're not going to sit idly by as they're being reined in by the civil administration, and with that our leader Okada has been killed at Tokyo Station. Similar to other pre-build-up civil wars in the game, like the Soviet Union or Spain, as things get worse and worse, more events will start happening to prepare you for the conflict. For example, the military declaring a strike, meaning you cannot train units, disband units, or edit unit templates. Certain units will become loyalists, and certain will not. You'll have to pick a new prime minister to try and guide the way ahead, which we can presume is going to be the moment you choose between the liberals and the socialists. As a final note, when the military entrenches themselves, you will have decisions on the map to choose which states you want to keep once things go south. I always like this mechanic because usually you can find some kind of cheese to take advantage of. Of course, not only will you be taking events, but you will also be taking focuses, and with them, we see stuff like trying to gain generals to become loyal to you, akin to what you get in like the Soviets, or alternatively, should Emperor Hirohito side with the military, you get to choose his younger brother, Nobuhito, to come to your side. After going through your events and picking your focuses, the time to strike will have come once you take the focus Revoke the Peace Preservation Law. Civil war will begin with the siege of Osaka Castle, and the time has come to bring back the spirit of the Taisho era. We don't really learn too much about how a hypothetical civil war would look in this context, as the dev diary just shoots over to the post-war settlements, which I guess is fine. With that, we can probably assume it works like how most civil wars work in the game. Once it kicks off, it's just a standard civil war, and you just have to rush for victory points. In terms of what the democratic tree looks like though, it seems to be split into two key sections. The top section is kind of the Reconstruction era, rebuilding up the nation after your civil war. With it, you'll have to choose between two types of government approach and 5 different focuses to choose which prime minister you want to start the premiership with. Notables include Abe Isu with his famous eye and his labor unions, or Ichiro Hatoyama, who is the founder of the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, which I believe is Shinzo Abe's old party. Sadly, we don't get to look at what any of those factions or the 5 different leaders can offer us after you go through your Reconstruction era. But in the post-Reconstruction era, we kind of explore our foreign policy and internal policy with democratic Japan. On the right, we have launched the income doubling plan to basically start building up the nation, the Shinkansen project, research slot, harnessing the power of the Zaibatsu, even a civilian nuclear reactor investment. On the left, we have our foreign policy, including finishing the fight and safeguarding the Shanghai settlement, which seems to be conflict outright with China. After that, we also have a split between going with the old alliance, i.e. joining the Allies, which one could have expected for a democratic country, but also the previously in the game West Pacific Treaty Organization, with a Greater East Asian Custom Union, Integrated Union, and the Greater East Asian Federation. We might have to talk about this in a sec. Covering some of these focuses, the Shinkansen project is actually a project, and it is quite expensive, 15% consumer goods factory factor for 2 years. After that though, you do get it into operation with consumer goods factory factor reduction and 5% research speed. Of course, by the time you get this all set up, I'm unsure how much 5% research speed is really going to be helpful, as there aren't too many late game techs. Maybe this is something you should probably speedline for, assuming you've really rushed the Civil War and Reconstruction. This can also be felt with Launch the Income Doubling Plan, with bonuses towards building civilian factories. Of course, by the time this is all done, how many civs do you really want to be building? And of course, that previous choice between the Allies and not the Allies. We can only note on one slightly interesting thing, in that by taking the West Pacific Treaty Organization, your faction gets 1 initiative point outright, which we didn't see with the going it alone in the monarchist branch. Initiative points, of course, being one of the changes coming with the faction rework. You can also note how with this particular faction, you unlock a decision to invite non-aligned and democratic Asian and Oceania nations to your faction. How broadly are we considering inviting any non-aligned nation to the faction? And how far exactly is Asia? The reason I bring this up is because the next 4 focuses take this even further. So as I said, you can outright declare on China. Okay, that's a pretty bold thing to do. But also, free colonized Asian countries. You can demand overlordship of Asian nations that are subjects of non-Asian nations, meaning Hong Kong's out, Dutch East Indies, Malaysia. But bear in mind, it says Asia. Let's start heading west. Isn't, like, the Middle East technically Asia? Can you start demanding Kuwait, Palestine, Syria? How far are we taking this? This isn't an arbitrary conversation either, because when you look at this piece of focus icon here, I can very clearly see the Middle East and Turkey in that icon right there. I really wonder if you're allowed to just demand Palestine, just outright, as democratic Japan. How peculiar. It almost feels like there needs to be some kind of reflective mechanic based on how close to Japan the nation is in order for you to get the acceptance chance. I understand that it like 9 trillion% will not have that, but the chances of them giving you, for example, Hong Kong would probably be a good 100 times more likely than them giving you Syria. With Guardian of the Pacific, it seems that you can completely bypass asking Britain and just ask them for control of your Asian colonies. Again, very interested to see how this focus interacts with the Middle East. And finally, the creme de la creme, the Greater East Asian Federation, unlocks decisions to integrate Asian states that are under our control. Additionally, unlocks decisions to integrate our subject civilian administrations, allowing you to annex puppets. Wow. Well, if there was any doubt about being able to core China in the monarchist path, there should be no doubts about doing it in the democratic path, considering you have a war goal against them and a focus to core your puppets. I don't even want to think about the context of you demanding India from Britain and then taking Greater East Asian Federation and then just outright coring India, considering the ridiculous population size. So China and India coreable just by what? Asking Britain nicely? Just, hey Winston, me old chum, listen, weird request. Don't know how you're going to take it. Can I core India? That's it. That's the request. No war, no drama. Just ask him and then core it. Incredible. You cannot tell me this is fascinating to see how this is going to turn out. This could be ridiculous. Oh my goodness. If nothing else, it's going to be funny to play on release, assuming it's really possible. It might just be the case that the chance of people accepting these demands is so low that the amount of colonies you really get from them is 0. Maybe India doesn't get agreed upon in this context. It's only owned states, like, for example, Hong Kong. Lots of question marks, but on the crazier end of the scale, this could be really funny. And finally, let's talk about the Soviet Union. Surely it won't be as dramatic an ending as what we just saw with the Democrats, right? Covering the unthinkable option is covering alternative history that was, well, unthinkable. The chances of a communist uprising in Japan was highly, highly unlikely, and so the representation here really does lean into some alternative history. One can therefore assume that the build-up towards the Civil War will be somewhat similar to what we saw with the democratic path, but with some different focuses, such as anti-militarist speeches, organising the underground resistance, returning the Manchu Kuo exiles, before you can revoke the priest preservation laws as we saw last time, and then head down your focus tree path. The communist tree seems to take an approach very similar to what we saw with the democratic tree, with 2 large sections, one being the Reconstruction era and one being the post-Reconstruction era, with a double split in the middle. The double split at the beginning is deciding what type of communism you're going to go with, the more Soviet style with first 5-year plans and the system of socialism learned from the NKVD, or alternatively going with the Labour Farmer faction ascendant and cooperating with the more anarchist elements. Ultimately, both trees do share some similarities, such as having to deal with the Imperial family and working your way down to overhaul the education system. And then, once you raise the red flag high, we see another split, kind of between internal and external politics, although in this case they both kind of feel external. With guiding the lesser states, you're recontrolling all of the things you lost after the Civil War. This will include demanding you getting things back like Korea, the Manchurians, working to guide the Chinese, spreading the revolution south, and getting a free Asia Pacific. There is of course still some focuses for internal development, such as the Ministry of Pan-Asian Development and a currency for all of Asia. On the left, we've got kind of more far-reaching socialism, working towards building up your navy and dealing with the foreign powers, ending in a Pacific Union of Soviet Socialist republics. This focus is remarkable for what it can lead to, if possible, but just to give you a brief overview, similar to what we saw with the Democratics, it is of course a unify all of Asia focus, but with options to spread revolutionary flames to India, to the Mongols, into the Soviet Union. We have options to deal with Australia, Indonesia, Thailand, and yep, it's definitely there. That's Turkey. I see Saudi Arabia. I see Turkey. I mean, that truly is the Red Dawn over Asia. I'm not going to cover the pre-Civil War path focuses too much, because there's not really too much to say in terms of differences. One can expect opportunities to get people on their side, get states, try and subdue protests, and work towards winning the Civil War. Similar focuses to previous versions can be found here too, such as raiding army depots to get early weapons, increasing your communist supply, gaining units when the uprising begins. The real conversation then begins once the Civil War is over into the Reconstruction era. Do you go lecture group, or do you go Labour-Farmer faction? The choice here seems to be present with a event, going the Kozaha or the Ronoha. Choosing to go with the more sort of Marxist-Leninist approach, we get some 2 operative slots, my goodness, if you really want to go with the operative play, or the Labour-Farmer faction, much more simple, 5% political power. Going with the Marxist-Leninist lecture group, we can find focuses that feel very similar to playing the Soviet Union, building up great big cities with populations, building slots, manpower. I assume you're hoping to go in some kind of mass assault doctrine. It continues as you go further down, buffs towards recruitable population, raising militia, recruitable population factor. It feels like building a giant army to hold out against the Germans, although there are no Germans. Strange. Alternatively, we could go with the more rural farmers version of the communist socialism that we're going for. With it, we start with the Uno school of economics, which seems to be a much more industrialist path, building slots, and a decision I really like the look of, to improve the state category if the infrastructure is more than 4 in a state. I really like this idea. It kind of makes me sad that it's locked behind a focus tree, as it feels like one of those mechanics you could imagine being applied on a much wider scale. You know, if you reach level 5 infrastructure, you can improve the state category to the next level. Because as it stands right now, there is a decision in the game that if you get max infrastructure in a state, you spend 100 political power to gain an extra building slot, while doing something like this kind of feels more, I don't know, fun, impactful, relevant than kind of a, oh god, did I improve the state category? Yes, I did, versus, oh, did I get the extra building slot? I don't really remember. Further on down, we see more focus on industry, especially with war communism. It's like communism and war. Additional recruitable population, so not too dissimilar with the lecture group, but the expected number of factories put on consumer goods seems to go up. As I mentioned myself, there is also a shared branch in the middle, with shared focuses. The fate of the Imperial family gives you 4 options to go with. Make them normal, make them in prison, make them dead, or make them go away. I would be interested if they went the way of Puyi, historically, where he was made to go to prison and then kind of became a normal person. And maybe in, 5 years, they could return and actually join your government. You know, like maybe you send them to prison and then in 5 years' time, they're reformed and a minor member of the royal family actually comes to serve in government. In terms of focuses, I can't gloss over Ganbarao because it comes with a decision, that if you have a level 4 or higher infrastructure in a core state, you can just build one civ in it. You can only do it once, however, but the idea that you can use excess political power to just spawn civs means that your use of civs to build mills can be much faster without feel like you're losing out on the trade equivalents. All in all, the communists feel pretty powerful. I guess that's what happens when you go with the unthinkable option. I'm sure this power creep won't continue in the next section. Anyway, let's talk about the next section. So as I said before, similar to what we saw with the Democrats, there are two separate branches that are both foreign influence. The key difference being here, of course, that they are mutually exclusive in the form of which path you took earlier. So you can't have both pieces of pie. Let's start off by looking at the lecture group, who want to form their own version of the Comintern. With it, you begin by creating your own faction, the 5th Communist International, with a free initiative point. It seems like the monarchists are really getting robbed of this initiative point. The long-marched victory, with only 35 days, gives you 2 years of division speed, Orgos when moving, supply consumption, 10% breakthrough, a really good pushing power. And then you start heading down. The Pacific Union of Soviet Socialist Republics unlocks decisions to integrate Asian states that are under our control. This is again talking about India, the Middle East, the Soviet Union, Indonesia and Malaysia with all its resources, China. And this focus tree path also gives you the option to puppet them, we can presume, and then core them. And you might also remember any state that you have for infrastructure in, which is a core, you get industry in. Holy snowball. Also, you can improve the state category of these 4 infrastructure states too. So you could go to Malaysia, you could core Malaysia, you could build up the infrastructure in Malaysia, and then you could improve the state category of Malaysia. And with that, let's not even talk about the recruitable population factor bonuses you get on top of the earlier ones with a Red Dawn over Asia. Alternatively, you could go with the farmers route, which is a little less cray-cray. It does involve you forming your own faction, the Pan-Asian Revolutionary Front, but it doesn't necessarily involve coring the entire world. It seems to be more so about inciting civil wars so that people can join you without you necessarily having to go in there and kind of get into a global war by yourself. Unlike with the democratic tree, I'm not sure that Britain is as likely to accept giving you India for free in this context, but all the same, the output buffs are pretty good. For example, just getting weekly stability, weekly war support, 5% research speed, this really pays off for what you lost out on earlier. And with that, we have basically come to the end of this week's Dev Diary. We will end this by having a chill look over some images of a tremendous amount of advisors you can get, but bear in mind, of course, this is across all the different ideologies and branches, including an anarcha-feminist, Kozo the Ogre and his swamp, and the Shadow Shogun hiding behind the curtain. Oh my goodness, it's actual God. I suppose now we should reflect on some of the things we've seen. In short, it feels like the historical and the Imperial way, monarchist emperor branch feel pretty solid. They don't feel too overpowered. They have good degrees of varying options and direction. They look pretty fun. In terms of the democratic and communist path, I think the early civil war will be a turn-off for some players because having an introductory civil war can be annoying. But if it's really easy to do, then these two paths might be some of the most powerful in the game. As is often the case, the proof is in the pudding, and finding out how some of these focuses interact with asking for puppets and then annexing them will be the big deal. With that though, I'll say thank you very much for watching. We will of course have more dev diaries coming, looking at alternative history China and alternative history the Philippines. So I will be seeing you then. If you like this video, feel free to like. If you want to see more, feel free to subscribe. It always helps me keep going. And with that, that is it. Bye.